SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the course An Introduction to Disability Studies. In the lecture number 17, I am going to talk about identity, politics and disability. So, before I get into this discourse of identity and politics and disability, let me go back and see what we discussed in the previous lecture that was titled as the question of education, space and disability. Right? What I mean to say that why did I talk about education and space in relation to people with disability? So, as we all know that education is a one important component in our society that has ability to promote or change the life of people with disability. Education is something which everyone has made an attempt to be included in that discourse. People, state, movements are done so that these things can be happening for us. Without education, as we saw in the RTE Act, CRPD, RCPD, right, lot of conventions are ratified so that people with disability can be included in the education, but obviously, I highlighted three important problems and second is we also talked about inclusive education. So, let us talk about first the problem that I identified and then I will talk about idea of inclusive educations. So, the problem is one, do we have enough infrastructure in its place to include people with disabilities? Second, do we have teacher trained who can teach people with disabilities? Third, do we have assisted devices which can change the reading materials of people with disabilities? So, these are the three important concerns that we talked about, and also we talked about the problem that has with transportations. We also talked about what if people with disability need extra help, how are we going to cater that. So, because people with disability cannot be thought or conceptualized as we think about every other human beings. So, they are very different, they have a diverse need, they have a different expectations, their experiences are very different. So, addressing those problems, addressing those needs, we have to think for them, behalf of them, right, and it is only possible when we are meeting people with disabilities, we are encountering children with disabilities and see what they need. Until and unless we address those problems, the idea of inclusion will not exist. Second, talking about the idea of inclusion, we also talked about inclusive education. Here you saw that inclusive education not only means giving the accessibility to people with disabilities, so that they can come to classrooms and access the buildings. Obviously, that is a very much requirement that every education space must do, but it does not stop here. There are many attempts that must be made by academic administrators, academicians, administrators and also fellow people, so that they can be accommodated, so that the other changes can be incorporated. And also I was emphasizing that is one very important point about the sensitization. Our teachers and friends, students sensitized enough to understand that there is something called disability, which is so called look different, has a different issues and how we are supposed to behave or talk or treat with them. Are we going to treat as if they do not belong to us? or are we going to behave as if they are very much like us, or they are very much part of us? Are we able, are we in the position that we have given enough education about the disability marked with differences? Because since the normalization, through the process of normalization, people are so accustomed to behave, talk, listen in only certain way, and if someone deviates from the norm, they are not considered to be the part of education. Right? They are not considered to be the part of public spaces. So, what we saw in the previous lectures, that is very important. If you have not listened to that lecture, it is my humble request you go back and listen to this lecture. I am not only talking about certain conventions, certain policies, certain schemes, certain ideas administered by state political administrators, or let us say academic people or NGOs groups, but also I was talking about this very thinking, very problem attached with the very idea of inclusive educations. Like for example, special educations are in place which meant to promote education for people with disability, but again the problem we also discussed, that they are not talking about inclusive education, because if you remember in the slides I was talking about, that inclusive education is only possible when both people with disability, people without disability come together, study and learn. So, these are the important measures, these are the ideas where we are going to pitch for to promote inclusivity. This will not be possible if we do not address these concerns, if we do not talk about these concerns, and these concerns are missing, as we already saw in the previous lectures, that 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, till 1990s there were hardly any awareness about disability. There are hardly any concern for people with disabilities, and later on we saw that despite lot of initiative and movement, there was a problem in implementations, and people from the rural class, those who come from the rural side, they are still deprived of proper education, employment and inclusion. So, this very idea that free and compulsory education is not able to meet everyone, that is a problem, right. So, this is why this RTE Act, free and compulsory education, it will be only materialized if we are taking these measures in place, if we are implementing what is said, because as we all know, theory and practice, they both are different issues. Theory must be put into the practice, then only it has something feasibility to talk about, then only it has a concern, the concern that is showing it is on the ground level. So, we need to work on the ground level to talk about these issues and these concerns. Otherwise, obviously everywhere there is discussion, but it is no point of talking about all this. So, with this I will move to the lecture number 17, which is dedicated, which is about identity politics and disability. But if you recall my previous lectures, I have already touched upon identity, right. I also talked about how postmodernism and post-structuralist thinkers have talked about the very idea of identity. Now, the first and foremost question that you will have, why in this lecture I am going to talk about identity politics and disability, that is the first question, and let me answer to that. It is because when we are looking at disability studies, we will not able to understand the trajectory until and unless we touch upon the discourse of identity in relation to people with disabilities. Because there are many thinkers, they talk that until and unless we define, we discuss what is going to be the identity of disability? In what ways we are going to define people with disabilities? Until and unless we chart out this idea, it is not possible to talk about disability, right? So, identity becomes one of the important concern for every academic disciplines, whether it is feminist studies, environmental studies, animal studies, whatever study you name. After the culture studies intervened or postmodernism started coming into the picture, people started talking about identity politics. That becomes a new phenomena. That first, let us see how to define disability, how to define who or what he or she belong to, right. So, until and unless we do this, how are we going to address the problem? But again, it does not stop here. Politics means why everyone is so much bothered and concerned about identity, right. So, both ways, right. As a thinker, our job is to look at the both sides. Why people are so much concerned about identity? Does it have something rigorous, significant to talk about, or it is mere politicization, right. So, these are the important points through which I am going to open up the entire discourse. So, today what I am going to do, I have talked about thinkers, lot of thinkers, or like obviously if you see, there are many thinkers, they have talked about disability studies. One by one I will be talking about. Second, I will be also talking about that how disability studies is very relevant in terms of identity politics. Why do we need to talk and think about identity politics, right? So, before I get into the slides, I will just make a disclaimer that today you have to more dependent upon the slides and at the same time listen to me, because each slide is theoretically loaded. Each slide is going to speak something about identity in a different ways. There are many notions which may agree or disagree with each other, right. So, here you see that what I am asking you, that I will be reading the slides one by one, each point, and then I will be elaborating for you. So, this is why we are going to be more dependent today on slides, because one points linked with the another points, and you will also get to know the name of thinkers and ideas, that how are they talking about identity politics. So, with this, let us go back to the slide number 1. Okay. So, first slide is talking about Simi-Linton. Simi-Linton's famous article, I am sure that you have read, Reassigning Meaning. So, there is a book called the Disability Studies Reader, edited by Leonard J. Davis, Professor Leonard J. Davis. In that, Simi-Linton has written an article on reassigning meaning. It is my humble request to you all that you must read that article. It is easily available. So, read that article so that you can understand what Simi-Linton has to say about reassigning. Think about it, assigning meaning, reassigning meaning, which means that Simi-Linton is going to look at the ways through which meaning are reassigned, can be reassigned, which means to say again, which I have been talking about, that body has a different meaning. It depends in what culture it is, how it is interpreted. If you question certain prevalent notions, you can give some other meaning to the bodies. That is why you see that the very idea of a woman, the way it existed in 70s and 80s, it does not exist in the same way in 90s or further 2000, like 20th century, 21st centuries, right. Later on 21st century and 20th century, the meaning of women differ dynamically from each other. So, that is why I am arguing you that please read Reassigning Meaning by Simi-Linton, right. And there is another book that she has written, it is called claiming disability, right? Claiming disability, knowledge and identity. Now, you see the title itself, claiming disability, right, where you are going to claim that I am disabled. Why one has to claim that he or she is disabled? Why is it important that one has to identify himself or herself with particular section? Let us say, for example, now there is a huge discourse emerging and where people are saying that I identify myself as so and so, because it is not about the body in which you are born. I am repeating it again. It is not about the body in which you are born. It is more about, right, it goes one step ahead. It is more about how do you identify your body, how do you look at your body, how do you think about your body. So, there are two perceptions. So, the one perception is how you look at your body, and there is another perception how someone else look at your body. So, society claims different way and you claim something different. So, now the focus is shifted. It is more talking about how an individual identifies oneself, S-E-L-F, right. Okay, so, look at the slide number 1. The first point in claiming disability, knowledge and identity, Similington highlights how disabled individuals have coalesced into a cohesive group, finding strength in their shared experiences and community. Look at this line, I am going to explain about it. Shared experiences and community connections which serve as the source of identity, motivation and information. Let me give you an example for you. Let us say, for example, as an Indian, when you go to US or when you go to UK or any part of other countries, why do you look for someone called Indian, right? Do you ask, you keep thinking, will you have some Indian in your neighbor? Are you going to have some classmates as an Indian? Is there a possibility to find some Indian in the campus? And the moment you guys find some Indian or from your own nationalities, you immediately connect, right? You create a kind of a bond. Why is it so? Because in a different country, it is only an Indian can share somewhat more or less the same experience with you, because he also come from the same land, same nationality, same country where are you from, right. This is also happens when you move from one state to another, right. Northeast coming to the northern part of India, right. So, when you move from one state to another or one country to another, you are going to look for a kind of a participation, sharing experiences, because that is how you connect, you can share your pain itself, right. So, even sharing pain makes you feel significant, sharing pain makes you feel relieved, and point it, you cannot share your pain with any X, Y, Z. You only share your pain with someone who you think can understand you better way than anyone else in that group, right. So, this is what kind of sharing experience bonds a kind of a community, where you build a connection. Let us say, for example, if you are living in a foreign land and you want to celebrate festival called Holi, how are you going to do that? Are you going to celebrate your festival, show your enjoyment with someone who is not from your community and who has no idea about Holi? Obviously, you can teach and train that what this idea is all about, but obviously, you can understand the complexities and the problems I am trying to talking about. Because if you meet one who is from your community, who knows idea of Holi festival, you can easily connect, you can talk, you can share experiences. So, this is about a kind of a motivation if you are feeling discriminated. It is basically called a source of identity. sharing experiences is called of identity, like you both are shares of experience, there is a possibility that you both are kind of one identity, right. Let us say for example, as a student, my identity is as a student, the pressure of exam only a student can understand. It's like he is from the same identity because he also go through the same pain. Now, you must be thinking that why I am constantly emphasizing upon the pain, because trust me, it's a pain that connect people more than anything else. Through the pain, you get connected so often. It's a pain that links you much more than anything else, right. So, this is what Simi Linton is talking about. Look at the slide please again. What it says, that Simi Linton highlights how disabled individuals have coalesced into a cohesive group, finding strength in their shared experiences and community connection, which serves as a source of identity, motivation and information, right. So, this is what Simi Linton is talking about, identity, and how through the sharing experiences you can connect identity, right. So, I have already spoken about it, right. So, identity means one thing is that you talk about identity in difference with something, like let me give you an example again. Obviously, I had discussed this, but before I proceed further, I would like to give you an example, then you can understand this better. How do you think a color of red is red? If imagine there is no white, blue, pink, gray, black color exist, right. When you are going, right, when you are going to cross the lights, the signals, how do you know that there is a called green, yellow or red light? You know in the absence of something, right, in the difference of something. So, you see that yellow light is not on, you see that green light is not on, red light is on. So, red light is a red light because there is not other lights. In difference to other lights, how do you know that you are going to pick up a white shirt? You are going to pick up a white shirt because you know it is not a black, it is not red, it is not yellow, it is not XYZ, right. So, identity is only gets its meaning in difference with something. If there is no difference, it is impossible to find out the meaning, right. Think about Saussure. I am talking about Cours de General Linguistique that was published in 1916, where Saussure is talking about language. He is not talking about language actually. Through that linguistic study that was done by Saussure, people pick up the same ideas and apply in different studies, and obviously that was really helpful in thinking about the identity discourse or identity politics. So, again, if you really want to understand this concept very clearly, you must go back and read Ferdinand de Saussure's book Cours de General Linguistics, right, because that is a book which explains what it is about, right. So, in difference of something, something gets identity. If there is no difference, there is no meaning at all. Meaning is generated in difference, right. Let us say for example, when I say I met a cat, you only get to know when you know that cat is not rat, rat is not a cow, so on and so forth, right. Even if you have not seen the cat I met, but you understood what does it mean, all right. So, identity, you give an identity in difference of something. I am a man. This identity, to identify myself as a man, is because I am identifying myself with masculine traits, right. I am a man. When I am saying so, I basically identify myself, the identity given to me, I am giving myself an identity of a man because it is not a woman, because I do not identify myself with the feminine traits. I see, I perform, I work like a man, which means performing a masculinity. So, you see, masculinity can be only defined and understood in a binary opposition to femininity. If there is no discourse of femininity, there is no discourse of masculinity. You remember, I was talking in the same lecture, same ideas in a previous lecture, when I was saying that there is no idea of diseased body, healthy body. There is no idea of healthy body if there is no idea of diseased body. So, the idea of disability, idea of healthy body is derived from the idea of diseased body, right. So, this is what, how I'm just giving you slight picture of making you understand that how identity politics work, how identity works, how someone gets identity in difference or in binary opposition of something, right. So, I am sure that now you understood this idea. Let us go back to the slide, please. Look at the point, David D. Mitchell and Caroline Alcindor. So, read him, they are extremely influential, right. You see that in the first slide, I have used Simi Linton, David C. Mitchell and Sharon Alcindor, Thompson, Leonard J. Davis. So, there are 4 scholars I have already named. Why I am giving you these names? Because so that you can read and relate and understood in details what they are speaking about. So, David T. Mitchell and Sharon Alcindor express regret over the slow recognition of critical parallels between disability and other marginalized identity. That is a very important argument here. David C. Mitchell and Sharon Alcindor is talking about. He is saying that why it took so long that other identity can identify themselves as a disabled. For example, when the feminist studies or feminist movement started in 1980s, why did it not include people with disabilities, right? Because other marginal identity also share more or less the same experience as the experience is being shared by other identities. So, other identities share the same experience as disability people share the experience. You got this idea, right? So, this is a very sad to think that other marginal identity did not think that disability is one among them, that they are both, because discrimination is common. Now, you may say that, but the level of discrimination, but the kind of discrimination, the nature of discrimination and the very function of discrimination is different, but there is a discrimination, right. There is a discrimination which discriminate on the logic of the body you are in. Women are discriminated, you remember that Aristotle says that, mutilated one. Disability people are also discriminated because they are disabled. So, the common with these two people are the body they are born in, right. So, that is why David T. Mitchell and Sharon Alcindor is talking about that why not we can bring other marginal identities along with or align with people with disabilities. All right, let us go to the next point. Rosemary Garland Thompson, she portrays people with disability as a political minorities who have historically been deprived of subjectivity and agency. So, here Thompson is talking about that how people with disabilities are deprived of subjectivity and agency, because identity is not given to them. They are not acknowledged as if they are also being discriminated because of the social problems. People tend to feel that they are discriminated because there is something wrong with them. They fail to understand that their discrimination is based on the idea that there is something wrong with the society. And still today we see that lot of people with disabilities who are deprived of their subjectivity and agency. Agency and subjectivity, they are both culturally loaded terms, right. Subjectivity basically is, in one line if I have to tell you, that it talks about that how do you express your experiences, how your experiences constitutes you, right, how you are constituted by the society or through your experiences. And agency simply means that whether you are in position to perform, whether you are able to work, whether you can take autonomous decision, whether you can make any choices, right, independently. Who makes your choices? Most of the time, if it comes to people with disabilities, choices are made for them. They do not make choices. Choices are made for them. If that is the case, where is the agency of people with disabilities? Right. So, this is what Rosemary Garland Thompson is talking and arguing. All right. Let us go to next point. Look at the slide, please. Even though Leonard J. Davis critiques identity politics in Bending Over Backwards, he paradoxically predicts that the profound marginalization of disabled individuals will ultimately catalyze the emergence of disability as a significant new identity. Right. So, two things I would like to make this point, that first, he has written many books and that all concern people with disabilities. In fact, it all goes and addresses that concern disability scholars. So, here in Bending Over Backwards, he is paradoxically predicting that the profound marginalization of disabled individual will ultimately catalyze the emergence of disability as a significant new identity. Right? Why does he say so? That new identity can be formed for people with disability. Right? It can be formed as a new form of disability because the very attempt to make constantly, the constant attempt that is made to marginalize them. The very attempt, the very apparatuses involved to make them marginalized is going to give them a new identity. They will look so distinct and different that why is it so that society is so much under the pressure to discriminate them or to exclude them or to marginalize them. Right. So, that is where people with disability will form a new identity. All right. Let us go back to the next point in the slide. So, look by the slide, please. Many disability scholars, even those who have adeptly incorporated post-structuralist theories into their work, have responded to certain developments with mixed feeling of frustration. They argue that constructivist challenge to identity can something be perceived as academic indulgence that divert attention away from the real life experience of people with disability. That is a very, very important argument, right. So, I would like to explain this to you before I move to the next slide. What is talking about? So, there are a group called a thinker academician who are talking about social constructivist, which means to say they look at everything as a socially constructed, right. They look at everything as if everything is socially constructed, which means to say that we are feeling disabled because of the problem environment has, because of the inaccessible structure in place, and due to that I am feeling incapable of accessing that building, and that is making me feel that I am disabled, right. That is one idea. So, social constructivists talk about that everything is socially constructed. But there are people who think that if we believe so, obviously to certain level that is true, that has a sense, that makes a point. But what if people rely upon this notion completely? So, which means to say that obviously they are arguing for, social constructivists argue for, that we should change the society. We should form a new norms, or normative structure should be flexible, so that maximum people can be incorporated into this, right. So, these are the pretty notion prevalent in social constructivist argument. But there is another danger. The another danger is if people rely that everything is socially constructed, what about the experience, real life experiences of people with disabilities? Because then we are not going to listen to them, we are not going to talk to them, we are not going to rely upon anything that they speak, because we think that it is all socially constructed. So, do not you think that it has a potential to divert attention away from real life experiences of people with disabilities, and that is where we need to also pitch in. See, our job as a literature student or engaging with these ideas, our job is not to reject anything. Our job is to engage with this kind of argument. Our job is to see what they are speaking, what they are talking about, and what are the problem they have, and why they think so, what else can be incorporated in the given discourse. So, these are the important concerns that we have. So, one side where social construct is talking about that everything is socially constructed, we need to also look at the other side, that there is a possibility that it will reject the real life experiences of people with disabilities, and therefore, we should also academically indulge with this idea that let us listen to people with disability as well. Let us see what they have to say, let us see what they are engaging with. Alright. So, these two different paradoxical notion must be brought together. Alright. So, let us go back to the slide please again, look at the slide and move to the next point. Consider pivotal movements in some prominent writings within disability studies. So, this is a book by Rosa Mary Garland Thompson. If you remember, I was talking in previous lectures, right. So, let us look at this. Thompson is actually warning us that until robust civil right protection for people with disabilities are firmly established, right, civil right protection, disability politics cannot afford to dismiss the category of disability based on post-structuralist critiques of identity, right. So, what is talking about simply that people with disability are also physically abused. There are violence perpetrated on them, right. There are violence perpetrated on them. So, first thing that is required is that they should have a civil rights and the protection from any physical or structural abuse, right. Until and unless it is done, we have to keep putting post-structuralist notion of identity into the place. We have to keep claiming that identities are interpreted, reinterpreted, they evolve constantly. Obviously, this is the claim, but another side we also need to talk about that we need civil rights protection as well, so that people with disability can come into the public spaces without any fear. Alright, let us go to the slide. Although Thompson's language implies financial recklessness, Susan Wendell, there is another name, as I told you that I will be giving you the name of thinkers and philosophers or academicians who are very closely associated with people with disability. Susan Wendell characterizes postmodernism as a morally deficient, accusing its proponent of displaying cruel indifference towards the harsh physical realities confronted by people with disabilities. Now, you see, that is why I named this lecture titled as Identity, Politics and Disability. The very reason I titled this as Identity Politics, because even there are politics on the name of identity, right. There are people who are claiming identity, however, they are not possibly share the same experience. But another politics is this, that if everything is being politicized on the name of identity and thinking that identity is socially constructed, if it is that language construct the identity. So, what about what Susan Wendell is talking about, the physical realities, psychical realities that is being experienced, encountered in our everyday life, where would it go? Now, you will say that these are socially constructed. It is not your experience, it is fine, language has constructed these experiences. So, Susan Wendell like people are arguing against the very notion of postmodernist and poststructuralist by saying so that no, we need to take physical realities also into the account. We are not going to reject it. All right, let us go back to the slide and read the next point. Tobin Sievers suggests that recent body theory has inadvertently reinforced the most odious prejudices of ableist society. So, here I am going to name of his book. Please read Disability Theory, right. So, do read this book, it is a very extremely influential book for disability studies scholar. So, Tobin Sievers suggesting that, he suggests that recent body theory has inadvertently reinforced the most odious prejudices of ableist society. And then we have Davis. Please read the another book by Leonard J. Davis. I am writing down the Disability Studies. He has edited that book, basically is a second edition. All right, there are many editions of disability studies reader. Okay, let us see what he has to say in disability studies, in enforcing normalcy. Davis portrays post-structuralist theorization as a self-indulgent eroticism. He implies that postmodernists disregard disability because it lacks allure. Davis contends in the introduction to his book that typical postmodern theorist, whom he labeled the critique of Juchas, right. I am sure that you must have read the name called Roland Barthes, right, where he talks about pleasure and Juchas, is enamored with idealized notion of the body as a locus of a pleasure, a native terrain of enjoyment, right. So, what Davis is suggesting here, that disabled body is a nightmare for the trendy discourse of a theory, incapable of grappling with images of the paraplegic, the disfigured, the mutilated, the deaf, the blind. The critic of Jucha instead delves into the fluids of sexuality, the scene of lubrication, the lexicon of the body as literature, the heteroglossia of intertextuality, the glossolalia of the schizophrenic, but scarcely ever into the body of the differently abled. That is a very, very theoretically loaded understanding of disability and post-structuralism. In one line, because if I keep explaining one point after another, it will take another 1 hour. So, what I am going to do, what I am trying to do in this lecture is just to make you understand what they have to say about it. But as I keep requesting that you must go back and read postmodernist thinkers and post-structuralist thinkers, so that you can understand. Just now I talked about one person called Roland Barthes. There is another, I am just writing down, look at the slide, I will write down, is called Jacques Lacan, right. His book is called Eccritus, right. So, this is a book extremely important and significant to understand what Leonard J. Davis has to say. But what is basically saying, if so, that disabled body is so challenging that it is so difficult to be conceptualized by post-structuralism and postmodernism. Obviously, they can be helpful, but disability poses a challenge to be reconfigured or reconceptualized by modernist and post-structuralist. And that is why postmodernist thinker, whom Davis very famously says the critique of Jushas, right, critique of Jusha, they avoid talking about disability, because they have no idea how to tame this, because it goes beyond the language. It's difficult. It has to something bit against the notion what it says post-structuralism itself, right, because when you say that everything is about language, folded into language, but body has to say something more about itself. Because the language that post-structuralist, postmodernist speaks is the language not spoken by disability studies scholars. All right. So, that is the point. Let us go back to the slide, please. Davis' stark contrast between the schizophrenic and the differently abled suggests a forced dichotomy, overlooking the fact that post-structuralist theorists of sexuality often draw explicit reference to disability such as psychosis rather than erasing it entirely. What does this argue for? Disability thinkers like Davis is also concerned that most of metaphors chosen to debunk certain notions by postmodernist and post-structuralist scholar, they all use that concern that is associated with people with disability, like schizophrenic, right. So, something that has connotation with people with disabilities. So, imagine if you are constantly producing or using body of disability as a metaphor to speak or to talk about what you have to say, do not you think that people with disability will have a problem with it? Because they are again being redefined and reconceptualized, however, they have nothing to say over there. Is because for the convenience of for post-structuralist thinkers, they are using the connotations, metaphors that relates with people with disability or relates with body marked with differences. Look at the line here again, look at the slide please. Davis' stark contrast between the schizophrenic and the differently abled suggests a forced dichotomic, overlooking the fact that post-structuralist theories of sexuality often draw explicit references. Right, the theories of sexuality, if you look at the post-structuralist theory of sexuality, they are drawing references from the body of disabled people. That is where he has a problem. That is a psychosis. They are not trying to erase these problems, but they are trying to talk about these problems in the same way as the normative structure has conceptualized the people with disabilities. That is a problem. You got this? That is our concern. Look at the next slide please. So, many postmodern discussion of sexualities rely on terms evoking association with disability. Now, see, I am talking about the same thing, right? I am discussing, I am engaging with the same idea. Look at this, many postmodern discussion of sexuality rely on terms evoking, let us say what the terms that they evoke, and these terms associate with disability: aphasia, mutilation, castration, blindness. You see, there is a direct association with disability, and when they have to talk about sexuality, they are taking that association. Look at the slide again. Davis likely intend to convey and explicitly argue elsewhere that post-structuralism tendency to use bodily difference as a metaphor has hindered the theorization of disability as a social phenomenon. So, this is the one line which I have been trying to explain to you, is that if you keep using the body of disabled people as a metaphor to talk about theory of sexuality, it will hinder the theorization of disability as a social phenomena, and they tend to ignore and forget about it. You got this idea? Let us go to the next slide now then, because you understood this point. Look at the slide please. The frequent use of disability as a literary device in postmodern theory raises concern for various reasons. First, right, look at this. Why there is a problem in frequent use of disability as a literary device? Because disability is sometimes desexualized, right? Blindness equated with castration or hypersexualized, which means bodily difference portrayed as a sexual transgression. Nonetheless, as Davis acknowledges, these issues are not unique to postmodernist discourse. Disability scholars have shown that inadequate or distorted representation of disability are common across a broad spectrum of theoretical, cultural and political discussion. Marxist critiques suggest that identity politics can overshadow class analysis that are crucial for shaping a disability politics aimed at achieving social and economic equality, particularly for disabled people who are unable to participate in the workforce. Disability studies should also heed Foucault's argument that identity politics can inadvertently reinforce oppressive identities, such as depicting the disabled body as inherently less sexually desirable. Judith Butler has also insight into identity politics, and which highlights the construction of identity through the exclusion of others that can be effectively utilized to challenge the definition of disability solely based on visible bodily difference rather than considering it as an illness or invisible impairment. So, there are these attempts which disability studies must grapple with the notion that is a point. Excessive focus on particular identity may hinder collaboration with other marginalized group. And Sieber also argue that all political movement rely on identity claims, and that is a quote which asserts that identity politics is no exception to any other form of political representation. Right? Identity politics is, that quote, is no exception to any other form of political representation. So, as politics inherently involves the formation of coalition defined by various ideological, historical, geographical or temporal boundaries, he maintains that objection claiming identity politics as distinct only carry negative connotation due to the successful linkage of suffering with narcissism. He goes on to say that association between identity politics and narcissism is itself abolished, as the psychological trait attributed to people with disabilities are often conflated with those attributed to narcissists. Right? So, this is what argument you see what Bendy Brown has to say, like why identity politics is partially contingent upon the decline of critique of capitalism. Right? Look at identity politics is partially contingent upon the decline of a critique of capitalism. So, disability scholar and activists, they advocate for workplace accommodation, more radical examination that would challenge economic structure where resources are allocated according to the quantity and nature of one's labor. Only a comprehensive class analyst can confront the truth. Within the capitalist system, numerous people with disabilities alongside some non-disabled people may never attain income levels above the poverty threshold, irrespective of the accommodation they receive in the workplace. Right. So, this is basically Marxist questions which I am raising, which I want to make you understand that they all, whether it's Marx or Butler or Foucault or you name any theoretician, they are extremely speaking against identity politics, because it has tendency to produce ableist notion, it has tendency to collude with capitalism, and if happens, then the problem is that other marginal identities which Siebert has a concern with, other marginal identity will not align, because the moment you think that no, you are different from others, then people from other marginal identity will not come together. And you remember, since the first day in all my lectures, I have putting this emphasis that disability studies not only speak about people with disability, but it also vociferously talk about other marginal identities as well. But this very idea which I was speaking about, identity politics stand against it, and which is why we should understand the politics of identity. All right. So, let us go back and see the next slide. Here we have what Marx has to say, and one thing more, I mean just to read on Jewish question, that is by Marx, right. I am not suggesting you read many books, but please read this book, because this book is extremely influential when we are reading Marx, because that helps us to understand this entire idea of narcissism and identity politics. Okay. So, read this book, which will help you. So, I will just pick up this idea, because this is all what Sieber is talking about, and as I said that if you read this book Disability Theory, you can understand the entire argument. So, identity politics movement often demand the validation of one's identity. Let us say, for example, every person with a disability can recount stories where disabled body elicit both fear and fascination for able-bodied people who are torn between averting their gaze and being unable to look away. So, Sieber's likely does not intend to imply that individuals with unseen impairments are not disabled, right. His statement inadvertently suggests that only those with visible disability are included in the category of every person with a disability. This is a very powerful claim that he is making. All right. Let us look at this powerful quote in the end of this discussion, that is, all disabled people share similar narrative can also be examined through critique of identity politics, and they proposes the Althusserian interpretations, right. And there is a Paya who also observes that demanding respect for individual based on their racial or sexual identity implies adherence to certain script and expectation associated with those identity. And one of the pitfalls of identity politics is that it has a potential for coercion. How? Because that coercion may manifest as a requirement to conform to specific narratives to be recognized as disabled, right. So, this is the problem of identity politics, is that identity politics may also lead to coercion, because there is a pressure on people with disability to conform with that identity to be called disabled. All right. So, with this I would end this lecture. Thank you so much for your patience and bearing with this 1 hour lecture. So, see you next time, where I am going to talk about disability and literature. Take care, have a nice time, bye bye.